At 8:07 Monday morning, I walked into the office expecting one email. After 8 years with the company, 6 months of interviews, and nearly 2 years of quietly doing director-level work whenever our department needed it, the director of operations position finally had a decision. My performance reviews were excellent. I had led our biggest process redesign, managed major vendor problems, and helped stabilize 2 struggling teams. My manager, HR, and even the outgoing director had encouraged me to apply. At 8:19, the email arrived. They thanked me for interviewing, praised my 8 years of service, and said they'd selected another candidate. I was disappointed, obviously, but there had been other experienced internal candidates. If one of them had scored better, I could accept that. Then our VP, Martin, scheduled an 11 o'clock meeting titled Leadership Announcement. By 10:30, the office had developed that strange corporate silence where everyone is working very hard at pretending they're not exchanging messages under their desks. At 11, Martin stood in the main conference room beside HR. He talked about fresh perspectives, leadership potential, and the next generation. Then he introduced our new director of operations, Evan Mercer. The applause started slowly. I didn't clap immediately. I knew Evan. He was 25 years old and had joined the company 11 months earlier as a junior strategy analyst. Before that, he'd spent roughly 2 years in an entry-level consulting position. No significant operations experience, no large budget ownership, no history managing teams. He was now responsible for 73 employees, including me. But his resume wasn't what made my stomach tighten. It was his last name, Mercer. 2 years earlier, at a company charity golf event, I'd met Richard Mercer, one of Martin's longtime golf buddies. They'd known each other for years. Their families socialized together. Evan was Richard's son. Suddenly, losing the promotion felt very different. After the meeting, I opened Evan's internal profile, hoping there was something I'd missed. There wasn't. The next afternoon, Evan invited me to discuss his transition. He arrived carrying a new notebook and enough executive vocabulary to fill a quarterly earnings call. "I'd really like to leverage your institutional knowledge," he said. Then he asked me to explain our forecasting process. I did. Vendor escalation? I explained it. Staffing approvals? Again. Compliance reporting? Again. Then he asked me what one of the most basic abbreviations on our operational dashboard meant. That was the moment everything clicked. The person chosen to lead our department didn't understand the systems he had been hired to oversee. The next morning, Martin sent a recurring calendar invitation, Director Transition Training, 3 90-minute sessions every week for 6 weeks. Attendees? Evan and me. Martin called shortly afterward. "I need you to get Evan up to speed," he said. "You know this department better than anyone." I stared through the glass wall of my office. There was something almost impressive about the irony. Apparently, I knew the department better than anyone, just not well enough to be its director. "Is training him now part of my responsibilities?" I asked. A pause. "We all need to be team players during transitions." I didn't argue. I wrote down exactly what he'd said. 8 years in operations had taught me something useful. When circumstances become strange, don't rely on memory. Document them. I created an ordinary email folder called Director Transition and saved Martin's training request, the hiring decision, and the earlier email where he'd encouraged me to apply because my track record, and leadership experience made me a strong candidate. Over the next several days, I trained Evan on vendor contracts, staffing forecasts, reporting, and department procedures. And with every meeting, the situation became harder to explain as a simple hiring decision. Then, while searching my inbox for an old forecasting document, I found an email chain I'd forgotten. Martin had accidentally copied me on an early scheduling conversation. The email was dated 12 days before my final interview. Most of it was routine. One sentence wasn't. Martin wrote that he wanted to make sure Evan's transition can move quickly once everything is finalized. I read it again. Once everything is finalized. Not if Evan is selected, not if the panel recommends him. This was 12 days before I completed the supposedly competitive hiring process. I checked the timestamp twice. Outside my office, keyboards clicked, a printer hummed, and someone laughed near the coffee machine. Everything looked perfectly normal. The email didn't. I saved it. Then I searched further. Another message appeared. Then another. None proved anything alone. Together, however, they raised one uncomfortable question. Had the company already chosen Evan while the rest of us were still being interviewed? Because if that was true, I hadn't lost a promotion. I'd participated in a process whose ending might have been written before I entered the room. And I had a feeling the oldest emails were going to matter most. By Friday, training Evan had become the strangest part of my job. Every morning, he arrived with questions a director of operations should have been answering, not asking. I explained staffing forecasts, escalation procedures, vendor penalties, and the compliance calendar while he filled page after page of his notebook. Then Martin started forwarding Evan questions that used to come directly to me. The pattern was almost elegant. I supplied the answer, Evan repeated it upstairs, and somewhere between my desk and the executive floor, it became leadership. I kept smiling, and I kept saving emails. My director transition folder was growing quickly. Training requests, performance reviews, interview correspondence, messages documenting projects I'd led. Nothing secret, nothing altered, just ordinary company records already sitting in my inbox. Then I found something more interesting. 3 months before the director position had officially opened, Martin had emailed me about next year's staffing model. Buried near the bottom was a sentence I'd barely noticed at the time. I'm discussing a possible leadership path for Evan, so keep him included where appropriate. 3 months before the job posting. I checked Evan's employment history again. At that point, he'd been with the company for only 8 months. The coincidence was beginning to require an impressive amount of imagination. I didn't confront Martin. I didn't accuse Evan. Instead, I reviewed my own interview records. HR had sent candidates a scoring framework before the final round. Operational experience, people leadership, financial responsibility, compliance knowledge, and strategic planning. Those categories should have favored candidates with actual management experience. Evan had almost none. So how had he won? I requested my interview feedback through the normal HR process. The response arrived the following Tuesday. My feedback was glowing, but vague. Strong operational expertise, excellent institutional knowledge, proven leadership. Then the final line. Another candidate demonstrated stronger alignment with the future direction of the department. Alignment. Corporate language is fascinating when nobody wants to write down what they actually mean. I asked HR whether candidates received numerical interview scores. The representative paused before answering. Those records are internal. I understand. I'm only asking whether scores exist. Another pause. Yes. That answer stayed with me. 2 days later, Martin called me into his office. His windows overlooked downtown, where gray clouds hung between the buildings and rain streaked the glass. Evan was already sitting across from him. Martin wanted me to transfer ownership of 3 major vendor relationships to Evan immediately. I explained that 2 contracts were entering sensitive renewal negotiations. That's exactly why he needs exposure, Martin said. Then came the sentence I'd been hearing in different forms for weeks. You'll stay close and make sure nothing goes wrong. There it was again. Give him the authority. Give me the responsibility. I asked Martin to confirm the transition by email, so the vendors would have clear points of contact. His expression tightened for half a second. Sure. That afternoon, the confirmation arrived. I saved it. By then, I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was protecting myself. If something failed under this arrangement, I wanted the record to show who had made which decisions. But the situation finally crossed a line during our next training session. Evan was reviewing a staffing spreadsheet when he casually said, "Martin told my dad this role would be a great launch pad." My hands stopped over the keyboard. Evan seemed not to notice. He kept talking. Something about gaining executive exposure before eventually moving into a broader strategy role. I asked one careful question. When did they start discussing that? He shrugged. Months ago. They play golf almost every weekend. That was all. No dramatic confession, no villain speech. Just one casual sentence from someone who apparently didn't realize how it sounded. That evening, I stayed late. The office emptied until only the ventilation system and distant elevator bells remained. I looked at my 8 years of performance reviews, the training schedule, Martin's emails, and the timeline of Evan's promotion. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in leaving. So I opened a blank document and wrote my resignation notice. Professional. Short. 2 weeks. The next morning, I sent it to Martin and HR. Martin called within 9 minutes. He sounded surprised, then irritated, then suddenly friendly. "We really value you here." Interesting timing. He asked me to reconsider. I declined. By noon, HR scheduled an exit meeting. At 3:41 p.m., another message appeared in my inbox. This one wasn't from HR. It was from corporate legal. Subject: preservation notice. The first paragraph instructed me not to delete, alter, move, or destroy any potentially relevant company communications. Emails, messages, attachments, calendar invitations, interview materials. I read the message twice. Then my phone rang. Corporate legal. The attorney on the line spoke carefully. "We understand you've submitted your resignation." "Yes." "We'd like to discuss that before your departure." I looked at the resignation letter still open on my screen. Why? A brief silence followed. Then she said, "Because there are questions regarding the director hiring process, and some of your communications may be relevant." The office suddenly felt very still. I asked whether I should continue organizing my inbox. "No," she said immediately. Then she gave me the instruction that changed everything. "Please don't delete a single email." My cursor hovered over my resignation document. For the first time since Martin announced Evan's promotion, somebody inside the company wasn't asking me to train, transition, cooperate, or be a team player. They were asking me to preserve the record. And before I left that building, I needed to know why. Would you have resigned after seeing that paper trail, or waited to hear what legal knew? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want more workplace stories like this. I didn't cancel my resignation immediately. I called corporate legal back and asked one question. Are you asking me to stay? The attorney, Rachel, chose her words carefully. We're asking you not to make any changes to your employment status until we've spoken. That was corporate legal language for something is happening and you are standing close to it. An hour later, Rachel and a compliance officer joined me in a small conference room on the 7th floor. No Martin, no HR representative I'd worked with during the interviews. Just legal, compliance, and 2 closed laptops on the table. Rachel asked me to describe the director hiring process from the beginning. I gave her dates, interviews, names, and the sequence of events. I explained Martin's encouragement to apply, Evan's appointment, and the 6-week training schedule. Then she asked something oddly specific. Did Mr. Mercer ever tell you about conversations between his father and Martin before the position was filled? I paused. That wasn't a fishing expedition. They already knew where to look. I repeated Evan's comment about Martin telling his father the director role would be a good launch pad. The compliance officer wrote something down. Rachel didn't react. What about emails? I told them about Martin's message from 12 days before my final interview. The one referring to Evan's transition once everything is finalized. For the first time, Rachel looked directly at the compliance officer. The room changed, not dramatically. Nobody gasped. Nobody slammed a folder onto the table. But the silence lasted 1 second too long. And in corporate investigations, 1 second can be very loud. Rachel asked me to forward nothing and delete nothing. IT would preserve my mailbox exactly as it existed. Then she asked about my resignation. I submitted it yesterday. Would you consider withdrawing it temporarily? I almost laughed. 24 hours earlier, the company had watched me walk toward the exit. Now, legal wanted me inside the building. Why? We're reviewing potential irregularities in the hiring process. That was all she would say. I withdrew my notice that afternoon. Martin appeared at my desk before 5. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual easy executive smile. Heard you decided to stay. For now. Good, that's good. He stood there a moment longer. Then he asked whether legal had contacted me. I looked at him. Why? His smile tightened. No reason. They're doing some routine reviews. Routine. Apparently, routine reviews now came with legal holds and instructions not to delete a single email. I've been told not to discuss it, I said. That ended the conversation. The next week felt different. Martin stopped calling me casually. Requests that once arrived verbally suddenly came through email. Evan's training sessions were reduced without explanation. Then, compliance requested my performance reviews from the previous 3 years. After that, my interview calendar. Then, the names of everyone who had participated in my final panel. The investigation was moving backward through the hiring process. And apparently, it wasn't stopping with me. One afternoon, I passed the HR conference room and saw 2 compliance officers sitting with one of my interviewers. The blinds were closed 10 minutes later. By Friday, Martin canceled his weekly leadership meeting. The official reason was a schedule conflict. Nobody believed it. Rumors began floating through the department, but I stayed out of them. I didn't need speculation. I had something better. Dates, emails, performance reviews, a paper trail. Then Rachel scheduled another meeting. This time, she placed a document on the table. It was my interview score summary. I couldn't see every detail, but I saw enough. My scores were high, very high. Rachel tapped one column. Do you remember being asked this question? I read it. Operational crisis management. Yes. And this one? People leadership. Yes. She continued through several categories. Then she turned the page. There's a problem. My final scores had been entered correctly, but the recommendation attached to them didn't match what several interviewers had submitted. Someone had changed the hiring record after the interviews. I felt a cold pressure settle behind my ribs. Who? We're still determining that. Rachel closed the folder. Then she added one more detail. Compliance had found indications that Evan's selection may have been discussed before the formal interview process was completed. My old email wasn't an isolated oddity anymore. It matched other records, other dates, other conversations. For weeks, I'd wondered whether the hiring process had been predetermined. Now, corporate legal was asking the same question. And unlike me, they had access to every inbox involved. By Monday morning, Martin's office was empty. His name was still on the door, but his calendar showed every meeting canceled. At 9:12, HR sent a department-wide message saying he was temporarily unavailable. No explanation. 20 minutes later, Rachel from corporate legal asked me to come upstairs. This meeting had more people: legal, compliance, HR, someone from internal audit. The atmosphere had shifted from quiet review to formal investigation. Rachel opened a folder. We've identified inconsistencies in the director selection process. She explained that my interview scores weren't the only records under review. Compliance had compared panel notes, HR files, emails, and calendar entries. The timeline didn't match the official story. Several interviewers had ranked me as the strongest candidate. Another experienced internal candidate had also scored above Evan. Yet Evan had received the position. How? I asked. Rachel slid a printed record across the table. The final recommendation had been modified after the panel submitted its evaluations. The language emphasizing operational experience and people management had been replaced with broader criteria such as executive potential and strategic alignment, criteria that conveniently favored Evan. But that wasn't the worst part. Internal audit had found calendar entries showing Martin met privately with Evan twice before the job was officially posted. One meeting was labeled Career Path Discussion. The second occurred 3 days before HR opened applications. Then came the emails. Martin had written to another executive that Evan was the right long-term investment and that the formal process needed to be handled carefully because there were strong internal candidates. I stared at that sentence. Strong internal candidates. People like me hadn't been invisible. We had been obstacles. Suddenly, the 6 months of interviews looked less like a competition and more like expensive office theater. Rachel continued. Investigators were reviewing a potential conflict of interest involving Martin's relationship with Evan's father. They were also examining whether Martin had properly disclosed that relationship before participating in the hiring decision. I thought about the charity golf tournament. Martin and Richard Mercer laughing beside a golf cart, weekend games, family dinners. All those harmless details that suddenly weren't harmless when one man's son received a director position over candidates with years of relevant experience. "Does Evan know about this investigation?" I asked. "We can't discuss interviews with other employees." Fair enough. But I got my answer that afternoon. Evan canceled our remaining training sessions. All of them. No explanation. The next morning, he didn't come in. By Wednesday, Martin's profile disappeared from the executive leadership page on the internal portal. Still, I didn't celebrate. Nothing had been decided publicly, and I wasn't interested in becoming the office narrator of someone else's downfall. I went back to work. That turned out to matter. While legal examined the hiring process, my department still had deadlines, vendors, and 73 employees who needed decisions. With Martin absent and Evan suddenly unavailable, those decisions started coming to me again. Not because anyone announced it, because people already knew where to go. A vendor escalation landed in my inbox at 8:30. A staffing problem followed at 10. Finance needed revised projections before lunch. By 4, I was effectively running operations again. The irony wasn't subtle anymore. Then, late Thursday, Rachel called. We found something else. My stomach tightened. She explained that IT had recovered an email chain from weeks before the director posting. Martin had discussed Evan's compensation package. Not a possible package, a proposed director compensation package. Before applications had opened, before interviews, before I'd spent hours preparing presentations, answering panel questions, and pretending the decision was still available to be won. That email changed the investigation. This was no longer just about suspicious scoring or executive connections. There was now written evidence suggesting the outcome had been discussed before the official hiring process even began. Rachel said the matter had been escalated. Escalated where? She paused. To the board committee responsible for executive oversight. I leaned back in my chair. Outside the window, evening light reflected from the neighboring buildings, turning the glass towers almost gold. For 8 years, I'd believed career progress depended on doing good work and making sure the right people noticed. Now I was learning something colder. Sometimes the work is excellent. Sometimes the right people notice. And sometimes somebody has already promised the chair to a friend before you enter the room. But this time, the promise had left a paper trail, and the board was reading it. The board investigation moved faster than anyone expected. By Tuesday, Martin's name disappeared from the leadership directory completely. HR sent a short announcement saying he was no longer serving as vice president and that operations would report temporarily to the COO. No farewell message. No retirement language, just a clean corporate sentence where an executive career had been the day before. Evan returned that afternoon. He looked different without Martin behind him, less like a 25-year-old director and more like a young employee who had suddenly realized the title on his door couldn't answer questions for him. At 2:15, HR announced that Evan was stepping down from the director position while the company reviewed the appointment. Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. The silence said enough. Then Rachel from legal called me upstairs. The board completed its review, she said. Investigators had confirmed that Martin failed to properly disclose his relationship with Evan's father. More importantly, emails showed he had discussed placing Evan into the director role before the position was formally posted. The interview process had continued anyway. My scores hadn't been the problem. Neither had my experience. The competition itself had been compromised. I sat quietly for a moment. So, All those interviews should not have happened the way they did, Rachel said. That sentence hit harder than I expected. For weeks, I'd questioned whether 8 years of work had somehow stopped being enough. Now I finally had the answer. It hadn't. The process had failed before I ever entered the interview room. The company formally reopened the director position under a new panel. Martin had no involvement. Neither did anyone connected to the original decision. I almost didn't apply. Then the COO stopped me after a meeting. "You've basically been running this department through the investigation," she said. "Don't make us guess whether you're interested." So I applied. Again. This time, the interview felt completely different. No mysterious criteria. No vague talk about alignment. They asked how I would lead the department, and I answered with what I'd already been doing: stabilize the team, rebuild trust, improve vendor accountability, and make promotion standards transparent. 3 days later, HR called. "We'd like to offer you the Director of Operations position." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was shocked, because I wanted to enjoy the silence for exactly 1 second. Then I said yes. There was no dramatic confrontation with Martin, no speech to Evan, no victory lap through the office. I didn't need one. Martin lost his executive position because his own emails documented his decisions. The hiring process was rebuilt. Compliance added conflict of interest disclosures for senior appointments. Interview records could no longer be quietly changed without an audit trail. Evan remained with the company in a non-director role suited to his actual experience. And me? 8 years after joining the company, I finally moved into the director office. On my first morning, I found the old recurring invitation still buried in my calendar: Director Transition Training. For a moment, I just stared at it. 6 weeks of meetings where I'd been expected to teach someone else how to do the job I was supposedly unqualified to receive. I deleted the calendar series. The emails, however, stayed exactly where legal had told me to keep them. Because sometimes career redemption doesn't arrive with revenge. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with a fair process, a corrected title, and a paper trail nobody managed to erase. And the best part? I never had to destroy anyone's career. I simply didn't delete a single email.